Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my first video or first cheat sheet of the season. I've done a first draft already, so you can definitely check that out when you can. It's probably a very sort of, rough first draft. I tend to be very sort of analyticsy, I suppose. And, we have all the cheat sheets now that I'm building out, and that's actually kind of making me revisit some of the value picks within the game. I've already changed my draft a little bit because building out the cheat sheet allows me to sort of take the sort of macro view of all the players within the game. If you've never seen the cheat sheet series before, it's effectively almost a tier list of all price points and positions within FPL, kind of tiering how good players are given the sort of situation we are in the landscape, right? For example, from game week 1, it's kind of looking at how good the fixtures are for some teams. Some players are obviously fixture proof in a sense, where let's say a Rodgers last season was just generally underpriced. A good example of that in the midfield position. There's also players who, I don't know, just continually score points every single match, like Salah was doing at one point last season. But that's kind of what the cheat sheet series is looking at. It's taking into account the fixture difficulty, it's taking into account the underlying stats, the actuals from last season, and a new thing, which is going to be the CBRIT per 90 numbers as well, right? We're looking at clearances, blocks, recoveries, interceptions, and tackles for the season. If you get more than 12 as a midfielder, you will get an additional plus 2 points per game. And it's binary, right? You either get the 2 points or you don't, and you don't get multiples of the 2 points. It's just a hard 2 points, very much like a clean sheet would work in FPL. Now, looking actually at the midfield tier list, I'd say a lot of the advanced data actually comes from Fantasy Football Hub, so this is a great time to shout them out. You can find them in the link in the description below. They're an advanced tool that actually gives you a lot of other tools, for example, within FPL to help support your playing. For example, expected points models, team strength rating models. So if you want to, for example, submit your FPL draft soon, very, very quickly, I think the Rate Your Team tool will be available, but you can find Fantasy Football Hub in the link in the description below. It's just generally a great tool that is trusted, that can also support you on your FPL journey if you want to sort of make that extra step and take the advantage of the vast array of tools available for premium users. So if we jump into the cheat sheet video, I think at the budget midfield tier list, I really think that FPL have done a good job at it. Like, there's no one that I would say right now is a hidden gem. There's no one who I think below 6.5 million screams out to me as someone who could be extremely attacking in open play, that suddenly plays for maybe, let's say, a mid-table type team or even a top team potentially, and can be, an astoundingly good pick. So in the 5 million tier, the first pick I've identified is Enzo Lefebvre. Now, interesting, he's very good at CBRIT per 90, right? I wouldn't say he's amazing, because the reality with CBRITs is you really want to have someone who's averaging probably more than 12 CBRITs per game to actually expect for a good amount of points per match, right? What CBRIT does is it actually raises the floor of players. So what you'll tend to notice as we go higher and higher in these price points in FPL, especially in the midfield position, is that all the sort of cheaper price points usually is filled with players who have higher CBRIT, because the idea, I think, in terms of how they're priced, is these are players who are floor raisers in your team. These are your fifth midfielders in your draft, or your fourth if you're going for a slightly different formation this year. Fair enough. But the idea is they're probably going to give you maybe something like up to 4 points per game, but not more than that potentially. Whereas, let's say, an attacking midfielder, someone who actually has good chances of getting, let's say, goal scoring returns, attacking returns, kind of assistive returns, they can kind of breach these thresholds a little bit higher. Because, for example, if you're very involved in sort of CBRIT type actions as a midfielder, that doesn't really increase your bonus too much. So you kind of have to think about these midfielders, and I think the pricing has been done well, where these are your floor raisers. And then obviously you've got people who actually generally have a higher chance of a higher ceiling. Obviously, look, Enzo Lefebvre can score a goal. I think I saw him score a preseason goal recently off of an interception almost. But if you kind of look at the underlying stats for Enzo Lefebvre, you're not expecting much from the goal scoring point of view. This is a player who had, I think, 2 goal involvements last season in the championship for half the season that he was sort of playing for. And the CBRIT numbers are still not good enough, in my opinion, compared to some of the 5.5 picks. I would only classify him as a differential. So the tier list system that I kind of have in terms of colors is obviously green is almost like a top tier pick, someone that I think can actually land into anyone's draft and makes a lot of sense. Then the yellow tier is almost good. And then the differential tier is that orange tier. I usually have an avoid tier, but I haven't used it because there's too many players to pick from right now, and I don't really overburden. I don't want to overburden you in the midfield position. In the next tier, we have 5.5. I think Elliot Anderson is the most insane pick in this tier. This is a player who's on set pieces. So I think set pieces is also something that's really nice, generally speaking, historically, for kind of creating the opportunity to have bonus points as well. He's also very much one of the best Seabrit players in the game. He's actually got better Seabrit per 90 than Caicedo, right? So if you remember the Premier League actually posting stats of the revised point tallies for last season, yes, Caicedo was plus 44, but actually if Elliot Anderson's to play more games this season, in theory, I guess he could actually do better. The issue, I suppose, with Nottingham Forest is that despite the early good run, they actually will be involved in Europe, and so maybe there's a bit more rotation planned. But if someone, let's say, like Gibbs White is an outgoing player, you can only imagine that Elliot Anderson's going to take up more minutes within the team, even though they don't play sort of like for like positions. It's just the idea of depth and who's going to play certain matches. I think Anderson is someone who was very much like a sort of consolidated first teamer last season, and you can actually expect a lot from him as well. If I kind of look at, let's say, his match logs from last season, I think he started pretty much most of the games towards the end. Like he started every single Premier League match from game week almost like 15 forwards up until the end of the season. So he was a very, very key kind of squad player for the team. And that's a huge plus, right? Sometimes he had some early substitutions, but for the most part, he was a very active player of the team. And I don't think we can really expect his minutes to be going much worse this season. He's actually one of their key players. As far as the kind of other options in the 5.5 position, I'm not sure if I'm in love with them, right? I think Tonali is actually an interesting pick because Newcastle have this issue as well with being involved in Champions League football. And actually, when I look at Newcastle's team, I don't think there's an insane amount of midfield depth. So I think the issue in Newcastle is probably, the question of whether Tonali is going to continue starting games. Towards the end of the season, I think he basically started every single match towards the end. And actually, he's someone who actually has really good NPXG per 90. So not only is he sort of someone who's actually kind of assistive, for example, Anderson's quite assistive because of the set piece aspect of things in terms of how that kind of breaks towards his underlying stats. Tonali is actually very much tilted towards XG, so that's really good in terms of goal scoring potential if you can ever get that from Tonali. And then he's actually just really good at Seabrits as well. I can imagine most Newcastle midfielders are. Bruno Guimaraes has in many, many sort of previous seasons been really good at Seabrit, not necessarily last season, but yeah, I think Tonali's actually at a very interesting price point. It's just the fixtures, I think, at the start of the season that aren't particularly amazing for Newcastle, but he's definitely one of the quality picks at 5.5 alongside Elliot Anderson, who just has stellar games to start the season, which is why he's kind of tiered above the rest. Adingra has amazing games. We know Sunderland have a really good run of games, but we know Sunderland is Sunderland as well, right? Yes, they are building a super team of sorts right now, but I think that Granit Xhaka move has been stalled. They've brought in quite a few sort of attacking type players, but I think the idea is, moving in towards the Premier League, you're not necessarily expecting them to be able to translate the performance almost another level higher. And so I think even though, yes, a lot of money is being spent, they kind of remind me of Nottingham Forest a few years ago, where they did spend a lot of money in the first season in the Premier League, but maybe the squad quality was really quite poor. I don't want to waffle on too much about Sunderland, but yeah, I think Adingra is going to get a lot of minutes. He's a key signing for this team. His underlying stats for the Premier League have always been very, very healthy. And, compared to, let's say, Lefay, he's going to just be more involved naturally in open play. So I do quite like Adingra as a fixture play for the start of the season. Caicedo, for me, is very, very, very much a floor raiser. Chelsea has some really good fixtures, but he's not going to be the main benefactor of these really good fixtures from Chelsea, right? The more goals Chelsea score, I still think there's going to be so minimal involvement from Caicedo, and that is reflected by his underlying stats as well as his sort of output last season, right? When you compare it to the likes of Tonali, Anderson, anyone in this list, really, it's not close. With Rangers, actually, I've put him as a differential pick, and part of this is because I don't think the Seabrit numbers are going to be good at all at Man City, right? Man City is very, very much a team that is the antithesis of Seabrit. They prioritize control. They don't like turning the ball over, and they'd rather keep the ball than, let's say, I guess, give the opponent the opportunity to take the ball. Obviously, Man City get hit with counterattacks, but that's very minimal within the game. Sometimes the City narrative is always they give the opponent 2 shots and the opponents score 2 shots. But when you think about that, converting that to Seabrit, they don't actually give the opponents too many opportunities. I think when you look at Rodri's historic stats, though, yes, Rodri is one of the few players within this Man City team who I think will rack up a lot of recoveries, but that's also almost like a positional thing for the team. I'm not sure if Reinders is necessarily going to be in this sort of position. He was very attacking AC Milan, but actually from what I saw within the Club World Cup, I think he kind of played a little bit more of a holding type controlling role. Even when Rodri came on as a substitute versus Al Hilal, I still feel like he's not as free as he was in AC Milan. And Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the underlying stats tell a tale, but I do think that there's a bit of transition where you're moving a player from a different team setup to the Premier League, and he's probably going to play a different function for this Man City team. And as a result of that, I'm not super keen on him. I actually think his minutes will be really good to start the season, and we saw his minutes were fantastic in the Club World Cup as well. And I can't see that really changing because he was a key signing for Man City. But I'm just talking about attacking threat for this Man City team. Do they have really good expected goals sort of numbers at the start of the season? Yes, Man City probably actually have the best attacking numbers expected to start the season, outside of probably Liverpool, just as a symptom of the fixture run, but then also just how good City are on offense usually. But yeah, I'm a little bit cautious on Reinders for now. As far as the next tier in the 6 million tier, Paqueta is obviously an interesting one because he is going to be the penalty taker of the team if he's allowed to play football. And I guess that's a pretty big asterisk right now because we're not quite sure what the situation is, but the underlying stats weren't super healthy. And he's also, benefiting a little bit from West Ham's early opening games. But once again, it comes down to things like whether his minutes will be good. Under Potter, it seemed like for the most part, his minutes were very strong. I think his Zebra numbers are actually amazing, to be honest, for someone who actually could be quite offensive at times. And so he's a bit of a mixed bag. And ultimately, I think he's a solid pick, but the underlying stats in open play aren't, anything to sort of scream home about. So that's kind of the drawback. With McNeil, I actually think his numbers last season were amazing. Clearly, he overperformed massively over his very, very short stint in the season. He had a massive injury that kind of stopped him playing maybe 2/3 of the season. I think he still racked up something like 4 goals and 8 assists. And ultimately, with Everton's pretty good start of opening games, I think he's actually at a really good price point. Towards the end of the season, he came back from injury, and I think he was sort of just working his way back to full fitness. So it's kind of hard to say whether Moyes will sort of fully utilize him from game to game because I think towards the end of the season, when he was actually coming back into the team, he wasn't playing too many games of football. He only started 2 matches, whilst I think he was probably coming off the bench for around 6 or 7 matches. And I kind of find it a little bit weird to kind of assess how important he is to Moyes' current setup. So I think he's probably someone who could be better, but I don't want to overshoot for now. In terms of the next tier player, I think Damsgaard is brilliant in terms of he's a creative hub for Brentford. His Seabird numbers are actually really, really strong, indicating that he's got decent opportunities of getting those +2 points and being a floor raiser. But it is that question of, Brentford are potentially losing a lot of their key players. Yes, of course, they've signed some players in recent years who should be coming to play. For example, someone like Igor Thiago is someone who was signed previously that I think a lot of people have forgotten about, but they have, I think, the idea of probably utilizing Damsgaard in a very similar role to last season. He wasn't that effectual in open play. He's someone who's very much XAG dominant, very much like McNeil. So he's interesting, but I think I'd probably wait and see and not so confident in this Brentford team to start things off. With Brighton, I think their opening fixtures are quite poor, which is why I have Minte quite low. Even though him and Jorginho technically would be quite interesting to start the season with, if they actually had a better run of games, right? Because I think the idea is with players like João Pedro leaving, with the Dinger leaving, you're almost just guaranteeing more minutes for players like Jorginho and Minte. Jorginho probably might get more minutes because Brighton actually have a little bit more depth, I think, in the right wing type position. But yeah, Minte was also one of the more attacking players, and his underlying stats were really good. Obviously, he's one of the few players within this list here where you have to contextualize that his minutes could be quite poor. In the next tier, we have 6.5, and we have finally one of our first few green options outside of Elliot Anderson, and that's Ismaila Sarr. Crystal Palace's opening run from an attacking point of view isn't amazing, but his underlying stats are just too good, in my opinion. I think at the 6.5 tier, he is like a standout gem for me where I think that for the most part of the season, if you think that everyone is kind of correctly priced as it stands, he's probably one of the only players I believe that is completely mispriced. And someone might disagree, right? If we look at, let's say, Crystal Palace last season, the narrative to start of the season was Elise is leaving the team. He was a very good player, and they will struggle to sort of match the creative void that he left. And eventually, I think towards the second half of the season, that sort of narrative was very much dispelled. And Sarr was a key player of the team here and there, and Kedia sort of had a bit of a surging role within the team as well, taking away a little bit more Mateta's minutes. But Sarr was an absolute constant for the second half of the season and beyond. I think pretty much from game week 7 onwards, he was a key part of the team and consistently clocking in more minutes than Eze and Mateta, mostly because the latter two players would struggle with fitness in Mateta's case, and then actually Eze in terms of injuries as well, and sort of coming back from injuries. So For me, Sarr is quite mispriced. Yes, of course, his actual sort of performances or the output wasn't so good compared to the underlying stats, but I think there's not enough data to say that Sarr is going to be a continuous underperformer. And also, you can kind of see with his underlying stats being so good, even in spite of him underperforming, his output was still better than anyone else that you can see, for example, in this tier list, up until, let's say, this sort of 6.5 position, with the exception to, let's say, McNeil and Minte. McNeil obviously had a small sample size for last season, so I think there's a bit of an asterisk there. And then Minte, of course, doesn't even play the full 90 minutes. So that's how good Sarr is, and I think he's an amazing pick. Ndiaye just has a good run to start the season. He is a penalty taker. We know that penalty takers were slightly nerfed in terms of bonus, but the reality is if you get to take penalties, that's massive, right? You still want those goal scored points, regardless of whether you get, 2, 3, 1 bonus points. And so that's massive for Ndiaye. Enzo Fernandez is someone who I think is a really good mix in terms of box-to-box midfielder in certain game states for Chelsea and certain setups. He kind of can play for as a 10, a bit more of an attacking center mid at times. His underlying stats are almost perfectly split. I think it's like something like 0.19 NPXG and then 0.20 XAG. So he is someone who is quite consistent in both aspects. Chelsea have some pretty good fixtures. Is he good at Seabrit? Not really. So I think he's good because the fixture on Chelsea is good. But is he someone that I think can suddenly sort of break that ceiling? Not necessarily, no. I don't think he's going to have a transformational year in terms of how he plays in open play. Kudus, I think he can actually have a dramatically different season. And that's kind of why I have him here. I think Spurs have some really good fixtures to start. There's some uncertainties about, how guaranteed his minutes are and how sort of Thomas Frank will utilize the sort of wing positions to start, what kind of players will be utilized, who will be sort of playing in certain positions, like, for example, who's going to be that sort of creative hub of the team. These kind of questions, I think, still sort of remain to be answered with a little bit more sample size from the preseason to be gleaned from. But I think Gudush is, just based on his sort of historic underlying stats before he joined West Ham, unfortunately, someone that I think is very exciting. So I do think he's got some potential to explode. And so he's a very good 6.5 pick on that basis. With Matoma, he's always been a very consistent pick. His minutes are always going to be better than Minte's. But do I think he's amazing to start the season? No, because the Brighton fixtures are just poor. In the next tier, I've actually got Rodgers as almost another green option at the 7 million point. And I think this is because Rodgers actually looks to have some really, really good fixtures. Like Aston Villa have a tremendous run of opening games. Rodgers is someone who, as we could see last season, just completely unparalleled minutes outside of maybe someone like Semenyo, right? This is someone who Emery trusts to play every single match and to sort of play different positions within the team, regardless of whatever is happening on the pitch. Him and Tielemans in particular. Tielemans is actually someone that is a 6 million midfielder. He's not amazing at Seabrits, but I would have considered having him here in the cheat sheet, but I just think that you're most likely going to pick one Aston Villa player. And I don't think I would pass up the opportunity to go, let's say, Tielemans to sort of ignore Rodgers. And so for me, Rodgers is the kind of clear pick here to capitalize on Aston Villa's opening run of games. Is he overpriced? I don't think so necessarily. When you look at a lot of these 7 million players, I think the beauty of them is that with Clivert, I think he always has slightly less minutes compared to his peers in this bracket, but he's on penalties, and that's a huge plus. Whereas with the likes of Semenyo and Rodgers, for example, these are players who just play insane minutes, and I think it's not even comparable to some of the other midfielders. For example, we saw Mitoma, someone who actually has really good minutes traditionally. He was still subbed in certain games last season. He was still coming off the bench in certain games. Rodgers and Semenyo just play that many more minutes, and I think that is an understated aspect of the game. Rodgers is also a young player. Semenyo is also a young player. These are players that I think can continuously grow. These are players who also played for teams that were very strong last season. Aston Villa were actually managing Champions League football, and Rodgers' minutes remained paramount. Semenyo doesn't have European football, for example, this season, and so I think as long as he stays in Bournemouth, and he should because he sort of re-signed his contract, these are players I think that can still sort of take their level up a notch, and they have, right, year on year. So what's stopping them from continuously improving? I think not much, and that's why I still think Rodgers to start the season makes a lot of sense in the sort of 7 million price bracket. Neto is someone who actually is interesting, but I think he's someone that I probably wouldn't touch, but Chelsea don't have established wingers. And what I mean by that is I don't think Palmer's really going to be played too much on the wings. He will probably play sort of a mixture of like a 10 role. Sometimes he kind of plays left wing. Sometimes he plays right wing. But Neto is someone who actually, I think, over the course of the Club World Cup and just towards the end of this last season, actually ended up becoming quite nailed. And with Madueke leaving the team, you do have some new players coming in, joining the sort of wing type positions, like Gissens, like let's say Estevao, and I think they'll be incorporated in the team potentially. Hard to say whether there will, but Neto will always have a place in the team. His underlying stats, I think, were a little bit poor-ish, but then at the same time, Chelsea actually have a really good set of opening fixtures, and I think Neto's minutes is still quite strong. Um, I still personally think though that the stats are slightly worse than some of his peers, and yeah, my only concern with Neto is that his minutes are sort of prone to dropping a little bit harder than some of the other players in this bracket, and I probably wouldn't be picking him up as my preferred kind of Chelsea player. Like I think I would even consider going Enzo Fernandez over, let's say, Neto, just because of the 0.5 million cost saving. In the next tier at the 7.5 million bracket, I have Eze there. He clearly had a bit of a sort of breakout season towards the end of the season. He actually had a absolutely awful start. Most FPL players who actually started with him in game week 1 probably don't have fond memories of him, but the reality is I think it almost seemed like he was the guaranteed or confirmed penalty taker of the team. It seems like, with the big asterisk here that I have, is that he is going to be Arsenal's next transfer target. Hand of Ozil seemingly is suggesting that that's kind of the transfer priority for Arsenal for now. So that's why I'm putting the asterisk on Eze. I think he could actually be someone who's going on a move. But yeah, I mean, if he stays a Crystal Palace player, I think he's going to be quite good. Crystal Palace's opening run of games isn't too good. Is he worth the additional 1 million over, let's say, Sarr? I don't think so. But I think part of the reason why he was priced a little bit higher was because a move to, let's say, Arsenal was sort of on the minds of maybe whoever's running the game. And that's probably why Eze is as expensive as he is. Is he completely overpriced? No. I think Sarr is very vastly underpriced, so Eze could still be well priced. It just comes down to whether he stays in Palace, because I actually think that if he moves to Arsenal, he's probably not worth 7.5 million, because you're taking away penalties from him, you're taking away more set pieces from him, and I'm not sure if the open play value, considering the sort of minutes drop off with the amount of Arsenal depth in place versus Crystal Palace, and where he's the main man, will sort of just make him worse. Gakpo should benefit a lot from Luis Diaz potentially leaving. So there's a bit of an asterisk to how good Gakpo is, right? He could actually be someone who I think is actually starts season maybe as a green pick, because I'd probably still think that his underlying stats are actually really, really strong. I think he really benefits clearly from a forward to midfield change. I mean, who doesn't? So yeah, that's kind of what my thoughts are on Gakpo. I think he can actually just be a better pick. Last season, we saw that he tended to be a player who was actually consistently subbed off at like 65, 60, or 75 minutes. But there were also some runs of games where he was also playing upwards of, up to like maybe 80 minutes. And that's partly because at certain times we saw Luis Diaz play in the center forward position. Darwin was sort of exiled from the team. And then Gakpo kind of was able to hold down that sort of left wing position for 90 minutes in certain matches. Let's see what the Liverpool depth is, right? Ekitike is probably going to join Liverpool very, very quickly. I think we have had the here we go already. So it's just a case of what Liverpool do to sort of manage their attacking depth if Luis Diaz leaves. And I think we can sort of make a better assessment of Gakpo as we kind of go on with preseason and see whether they actually make a move for another player. Gordon is someone that I have on the cheat sheet, but I think that's just to pay respects to Gordon. I think that Barnes really established himself towards the end of last season, especially with Gordon's sort of injuries. And that makes it very tricky, right? Newcastle finally have solid depth across both wing positions. You've got Elanga now, who's going to contend mostly for that starting spot at right wing, with Murphy sort of there to play 30 minutes or maybe even start games and play 60 minutes, and vice versa. And then I think you have the exact same situation with Gordon and Barnes. So Newcastle finally have depth on the wings, and I think that just is a huge negative impact on Gordon, and the fixtures aren't good enough for Newcastle. In the next tier, we have the 8.5 to sort of 9 million players. I think Wirtz and Bruno could both arguably be green picks. But the only reason why I don't have them there is because I think that they're almost optional, in the sense that the way I'd probably cover captaincies this season is I'd probably like to have, let's say, a 10.x million player alongside a Salah / Haaland. And I think that covers captaincy almost every single week for you. So that's kind of baked into the prices of Saka and Palmer. And that's why they're green. But in this tier, just right below it, I think Wirtz and Bruno are still optional picks. Bruno does very much benefit from the Seabrit change. And I think part of the reason why Bruno's price actually shot up is because of Seabrits, right? You're almost adding in maybe, let's say, an additional 20 points over the course of the season for someone like Bruno, just from Seabrit. And it could go even higher, right? It just depends on, let's say, his role under Amarim and whether that has a small impact on little things like how often he's being asked to do defensive contributions, because we've sort of seen Aaron talk about Bruno and how he kind of wants Bruno to operate a little bit differently compared to that sort of freelance role that he had previously in the team, which a lot of managers sort of allowed him to do. I'm not saying that has a huge impact on things like Seabrit, for example. His underlying stats, year on year, are pretty much permanently the same. Wirtz is a very, very creative player. He's going to, not have penalties, for example. He's going to be on quite a few set pieces, I imagine. And I think that's huge for him, because it's not like someone like Salah takes set pieces for the team. I wouldn't also say that, someone like Kirkes or Frimpong's going to take set pieces away. So, for example, a lot of Trent's set pieces should be redistributed across the team to different sorts of players, Wirtz being one of them. And I think he will very much benefit from that. It seems like from his early career, he's a very, very positive finisher. Do I expect him to sort of absolutely smash this 8.5 million price point? Not really, no, but I think he's underpriced. I just think that Liverpool's opening run of games is a bit poor, and at the same time, he's not a captaincy option. So, do you necessarily need to double stack Liverpool if you're going to go with Salah in your team? Probably not. But I think both Wirtz and Bruno at many points in the season will become green picks. With Bruno, I'm just a bit cautious on what his role is going to be and what that means for him in FPL. Right? It's possible that he can play an even more deeper role this season, and it kind of means that other players can cook, right? Cunha and Bumo, etc. The penalty nerf, I think, does impact Bruno quite a fair bit as well in terms of bonus points, and I just kind of cautiously want to put him there. I'm usually super pro Bruno all the time, but I think United's opening fixtures are also quite poor, so that's kind of the reason why Bruno is where he is. As far as, let's say, Marmoush, I think his minutes just aren't good enough, but I've left him here sort of out of respect, very much similar to Gordon. I just think that, looking at the Club World Cup, looking at even the end of last season, it's kind of hard to see Marmoush being out and out starter of the team. I think also, especially if Foden can come back into the squad and sort of reintegrate himself, that's asking for more trouble for his minutes. And so, we finally arrive at the premium tier, and I think ultimately Saka, Palmer, and Salah are just astoundingly good. One of the big things that I think actually might reduce Saka a little bit is this Gyökeres transfer, right? Gyökeres is confirmed. We got the Ornstein kind of confirmation as opposed to here we go. And I think that could make Saka lose penalties. And if Saka loses penalties, he's suddenly going to drop a lot in terms of the estimation. And I think he'll be vastly overpriced. But if he keeps penalties, if we expect Arsenal to improve as an offense this season, and for Saka to continuously make these personal strides that he has been doing year on year, well, then he's very much underpriced. So I think penalties move the needle very much on Saka. It could really be something like, somewhere between, let's say, 4 to 8 penalties in a season for a player like Saka. I mean, Salah, if I have to remind you guys, had 9 penalties last season. And I think Saka's minutes aren't going to be massively impacted by the additional depth within the team. Clearly, of course, someone like Madueke has been signed to be able to be utilized as depth in the right wing position. But I think that shouldn't hurt Saka's minutes too much. And so I think I still currently have him classed as a green tier pick. But if you had to ask me honestly, if I had to pick 2 out of 3, I'd probably go Palmer and Salah. And I think that's because Palmer's minutes are better. The penalties are guaranteed. The opening run for Chelsea is better. And I'm a bit of a Palmer fanboy. So that's it for the cheat sheet video. I'm not going to talk too much on Salah. I think Salah. I probably would choose Salah over Haaland even just to start the season, even though I think City actually have a better opening run of games. But it's also a case of, midfielder versus forward, and maybe me being hurt from last season. But Salah's still going to be an amazing pick. Is it bad to go Haaland right now? No, absolutely not. I think you can choose to go either or. If you want to go without, which some people have been contemplating, but I doubt they'll actually do, then you can do that as well. But I think there's some interesting sort of moves that have been made by FPL in terms of the pricing, and I'm very intrigued by that. Part of this too is when you sort of look at this tier list is when I kind of look at these kind of teams that I can possibly make, you could choose to spend and create a 3-5-2, which means that you spend a little bit more money in the players, right? Instead of going for someone like Anderson, you might even have a better midfielder. Maybe your minimum price midfielder is something like 6.5. At the same time, I just think that Anderson is an amazing price point, and if you can utilize the funds elsewhere, he could be quite interesting. So I think there's enough 5.5 picks that will probably emerge as being really, really good. But right now, I think I don't have too much confidence in anyone outside of Anderson. And then it kind of has to be the 6.5 tier where I think, okay, that's where you want to spend most of your money in terms of the midfield. And I think the choice of whether you go for, let's say, Wirtz or Bruno is definitely optional at this moment in time. But even going for that position within your draft kind of leaves room for your opportunity to sort of stay within that bucket, right? If you want to suddenly move between like Wirtz and Bruno, I guess being pre-invested into that within your template can help. Completely ignoring it means it's a little bit harder to go back into a Wirtz or a Bruno. You probably need 2 free transfers for that. But we know we're getting more free transfers this season anyways. So that's it for the cheat sheet. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys soon. Take care.